You are listening to The Bridge Busters, the first dam busters and the race to save Britain, written by Mark Felton, published by Mandalay Books, and narrated by Mark Felton. Chapter 14. Turkey Shoot. Jesus Christ! Sergeant Unsworth, Joe Collier's navigator, yelled at the horrific sight of a burning Hampden flashing past his plane a few hundred yards away. God Almighty! Collier exclaimed at almost the same instant as he pushed forward the throttles on his own battle-damaged plane after another low-level diversionary bombing attack. "It's Rossi!" he cried. Less than a mile away, Flight Lieutenant Mulligan aboard P-4340 also saw the flames as Ross's plane took a direct hit from one of the larger caliber flak pieces. "Get out, Rossi! For Christ's sake, get out!" he screamed as he watched, horrified, as his best friend's plane tumbled across the sky like a flaming torch, a tail of burning fuel following behind it as flak shells and tracer continued to detonate all around the stricken machine. "He's too low!" Collier yelled into his RT as Ross's burning Hampden streaked down towards the black countryside. No white parachutes emerged from the aircraft, which banked over out of control before ploughing into the ground with a huge explosion, flaming wreckage being flung for hundreds of yards in all directions. Collier and his crew felt the tragedy keenly. "Oh, God!" Mulligan sobbed as he watched his closest friend die, along with the 3 young members of his crew. "The poor bastards!" The point where Ross had impacted was just a flaming mass of debris on the ground. Mulligan choked back his tears, which mixed with an almost blind fury towards the people who had done this. He didn't hesitate. It was his turn now. "We're going in," Mulligan said over the RT, his voice flat and emotionless. His eyes narrowed as he began his descent. "Hell!" Joe Collier's navigator, Sergeant Stubbings, yelled as Collier continued to climb out of the dense flak over the canal, shells exploding all around his aircraft. "What's up, Stubbings?" Collier shouted into the RT above the din of detonations and the roaring engines. "I've been hit in the bottom," Stubbings replied, his voice incredulous and strained. "I'm bleeding," he gasped breathlessly. "What shall I do?" Collier involuntarily ducked as the umpteenth shell went off outside his cockpit as he struggled to control the aircraft in the disturbed air. "Sit on it until we're out of this lot," Collier instructed. There was nothing else they could do. A 20mm shell had exploded under the Hampden's nose, driving a white-hot sliver of shrapnel through the aircraft's skin and Stubbings' seat, lodging painfully in one of his buttocks. Stubbings drew a gloved hand away from his bottom, fresh red blood wet across the leather. He had no idea whether he was badly injured or whether it was just a flesh wound, and Collier knew they had to get clear of the target area before one of his gunners could render Stubbings first aid. As Mulligan plunged down through the curtain of German fire, the same barrage of flying steel that had just killed Ross and his crew instantly enveloped his Hampden. It was almost unbelievable, the density and intensity of the flak, but Mulligan pressed grimly on, even though he must have known that there was little chance of surviving. The German gunners had never seen anything like it before. The British had now sent a 3rd slow-moving bomber into their sights. The Englanders were either very brave or very foolish. Either way, the officers commanding the batteries ordered maximum fire against Mulligan's plane, determined to turn it into so much flying scrap in the space of the next few seconds. Hampden P-4340 shuddered and bucked, Mulligan struggling to maintain control. A stream of oaths poured forth from the Australian's lips, but a sudden loud bang to his left silenced him, and his head swung round to look. The port engine was on fire, its propeller whirling and flames licking out of the cowling and trailing behind the wing. The Hampden's speed dropped further, and she grew heavy on the controls. Mulligan glanced at his instruments as more bangs and crunches indicated that the German gunners had found their mark. He looked back at the port engine. The flames were spreading along the wing. "We've had it!" Mulligan yelled into the RT. "Jettison the bomb!" With that, the navigator jerked the release lever and the M-bomb fell from the aircraft, landing in the canal some distance from the aqueduct. "We're too low to jump," Mulligan shouted, wrestling with the controls. He couldn't gain enough altitude for the crew to bail out. "I'm going to set her down somewhere." The Hampden swung on over the canal and out into open countryside, leaving the flak behind. Mulligan powered along at just a few hundred feet, glancing constantly at the spreading fire to his left while he desperately searched for somewhere to crash-land the plane. It would be a belly landing. Suddenly, under the moonlight, he saw a large muddy field. It was now or never. If he tried to keep his kite airborne for much longer, her petrol tanks might explode, or the fire-wreathed port wing break off. Then it would be over for all of them. "Get ready, boys," Mulligan ordered, reducing the throttle on his one good engine, dropping what remained of his flaps and lifting the aircraft's nose. His panicked eyes glanced at the altimeter. It read 30 feet, then 20. Mulligan closed his eyes and raised both of his arms in front of his face. Squadron leader Lowe never made it to the vicinity of M25 or the Dortmund-Ems Canal. While Collier and 5 other aircraft successfully carried out the diversionary attack, Lowe's Hampden P-4304 diverted and carried out his impromptu attack on the Texel Island Luftwaffe base. Bombing from 8,000 feet, Lowe braved some light flak and searchlights, managing to make 4 passes over the base, on each occasion dropping a single 500-pound bomb. Neither Lowe nor his navigator bomb-aimer Sergeant Unsworth were able to observe the results of this work, before Lowe turned the aircraft for home and out across the Dutch coast towards the North Sea. Pilot Officer Hugh Matthews, the 22-year-old pilot of Hampden 4404, glanced at the clock on his instrument display. It was time. Exactly 2 minutes had passed since Mulligan made his attack. Matthews banked his aircraft over and warned the crew that he was starting his run-in. Matthews had seen most of what had occurred earlier. Pitcairn Hill, the first man in, had barely made it through the hailstorm of flying explosives. Ross had crashed and burned, and it looked as though Mulligan had gone the same way as Matthews had briefly seen his Hampden trailing flames, limping away from the canal at very low level. Now, as aircraft number 4, it was his turn. Circling further back was Babe Leroyd's plane, and he watched carefully as Matthews dropped into the attack, the aircraft quickly disappearing into the flak and searchlights. In just 2 minutes, it would be his turn. He swallowed hard and tried to concentrate on his flying. Aboard P-4404, Matthews knew a lot rested on his young shoulders and those of his crew. Pitcairn Hill had probably bombed, as he had certainly made a full bombing run, but no one would know if he had bombed accurately until the delayed action fuse activated. Ross and Mulligan had most certainly not managed to attack the aqueduct before they were shot down. There was only Leroyd left should he fail, thought Matthews, as his plane rocked and bucked in the heavy flak. Down and down went Matthews' plane. He and his crew were on an elevator ride to hell. In the nose, Navigator Sergeant Fennell screamed out course corrections, while the 2 gunners, Sergeant Gadsby and Aircraftman Allwood, hammered away with their Vickers guns like men possessed, ducking and flinching at each near miss from a flak shell or tracer round. Matthews levelled off at 150 feet and continued to slow, German rounds pinging off the undersides of his wings and fuselage, but miraculously without doing serious damage. Fennell, his face pressed to the bomb sight, continued giving directions to Matthews, ignoring a piece of shrapnel that smashed through the perspex close by and embedded itself, still steaming in the frame above Fennell's head. His whole focus was on the rapidly approaching aqueduct. There was a bang louder than the others, and Matthews turned to see one of his engines sputtering, sparks and flames spewing from the exhausts. "We're hit!" Matthews yelled. "Hold her steady, Skip," Fennell yelled back. "Target in sight." Matthews shut off the damaged engine and increased power on the other, adjusting the aircraft's yaw with his pedals. She remained on track. "Bomb gone," came the blessed call, and Matthews sailed over M25, followed all the way by gun flashes and bursting shells, before piling on the power and pulling clear of the carnage. "Did you see it fall?" Matthews yelled into the RT. I think it was wide, sir, Allwood shouted back. I can't be sure. Matthews cursed and asked for a course heading back to England. Fennell was sure he'd hit the target, but in the confusion of blinding lights, explosions and noise, it was difficult to tell. It would later be recorded officially as not observed, owing to intense light anti-aircraft fire. But Matthews had more pressing matters to attend to. With one engine knocked out, as well as numerous damage from shrapnel and bullets, keeping his Hampden in the air for the next few hours was going to be the biggest challenge of his 20-plus sorties into enemy territory. As Matthews released his M-bomb over M25, Flight Lieutenant Mulligan came to, still strapped firmly into his seat inside his Hampden. The aircraft had come to rest near Mezum, a village south of Rhina. He could feel fresh air on his face, which also felt wet, and struggled to pull his goggles from his bloody face. Half his canopy glass was gone, and when he looked up he saw stars scudding the night sky above. He tried to move, but couldn't. Something was wrong. As his eyes adjusted, he realized that the port propeller had smashed into his cockpit during the crash. Mulligan was pinned in his seat. He tried his RT, but it was dead. Instead, in a weak and breathless voice, he called out the names of his crew, but there were no replies. The only sound was the thump and boom of flak far away in the distance. Then there was another sound. Vehicles were approaching out of the darkness, their headlamps shielded. There was the sound of squealing brakes, doors slamming, and a truck tailgate being let down. Men were coming. Mulligan craned his head to try and see, a trail of blood leaking into one of his eyes, which he wiped away with his free hand. Suddenly, a man's head and shoulders appeared beside his cockpit. On his head he wore the unmistakable shape of a German helmet, a Luftwaffe eagle and swastika decal on its side briefly catching the moonlight. Guttural commands were given in German, a language Mulligan didn't understand. But he did understand one thing. He was now a prisoner of war. Babe Leroyd realized that the time had come for his attack. He was the last one left. His clock read 11:23 p.m. He was circling at 3,000 feet, about 3 miles north of M25, and immediately started a shallow diving attack, dropping to 300 feet as he acquired the straight line of the canal. Down he went, his eyes glued to the altimeter, until he gently levelled off at 150 feet above the shimmering water's surface and nosed into the flak umbrella. In his mind, Leroyd was only too aware that the soluble fuse on Pitcairn Hill's bomb was rapidly approaching its detonation point in slightly less than 2 minutes' time, and he didn't want to be over the target when the first M-bomb went up. Leroyd's biggest problem was the searchlights, which completely blinded him. Ignoring the high volume of flak that was starting to take his Hampden apart, Leroyd had to be able to maintain his bombing run at 150 feet above the canal, ducking his head down below the level of his cockpit canopy, and in an extraordinary display of skill flew the bomber blind on instruments alone. Shrapnel constantly smashed into the aircraft, buffeting it this way and that, the Germans determined to knock down this last suicidal British interloper. Leading aircraftman Rich ran through pan after pan of 303 Vickers ammunition as he poured fire onto the searchlights lining both banks, but it was a hopeless task from so low and using such a small caliber weapon. Wireless operator Sergeant Willis did the same from his position, and soon the interior of the Hampden filled with steaming, spent brass cartridge cases that rolled around on the fuselage floor. In the nose, Pilot Officer John Lewis blotted out the chaos and concentrated only on his bomb sight and the canal rushing past at 120 miles per hour. He knew he would have only a precious few seconds to align his sights over the centre of M25 and release the M-bomb. A hesitation of a second would mean overshooting, then it would all have been for nothing. But they had to get to the target first, and the Germans were not going to make that easy. Lewis was now effectively flying the plane, his course corrections and instructions instantly obeyed by Leroyd, hunched down in his seat, flying on instruments alone. One false move of the control column and the Hampden would hit the canal or a bank. One major flak hit, and the plane would quickly go out of control, killing them all. Time seemed to have slowed down. But then Lewis cried out. "Almost there!" he cried over the RT. Leroyd gripped the controls and concentrated only on his instruments. "Steady, steady, left a bit. Hold her steady." Lewis' voice sounded almost calm as he hunched over the bomb site, but Leroyd knew that he was as pent up and as terrified as everyone else aboard the Hampden. Suddenly there was a loud bang to the right, and Leroyd instantly popped up his head. A flak shell had gone straight through the wing, tearing a jagged hole the size of a dustbin lid. The Hampden lurched to the right, and Lewis screamed a correction. "Target in sight!" Lewis exclaimed. There was another almighty bang to the right of Leroyd's cockpit. Another shell had struck the Hampden, exploding between the starboard wing and the fuselage. Leroyd struggled to bring the plane back onto an even keel. "Hold her, Skip! Steady! Steady!" Leroyd held his breath, ducking his head back down. "Bomb away!" Lewis shrieked, the M-bomb leaving the aircraft with a heavy clunk, its parachute barely having time to open before it plunged into the aqueduct, porpoised once, and then sank like a stone to the bottom 14 feet below. The Hampden had already flashed through and was away, followed by more ragged bursts of anti-aircraft fire as Leroyd opened up the throttles and climbed clear of the action. Leroyd pulled the plane into a tight right turn to throw off the German gunners, and keeping low for some miles, went hell for leather across the countryside. "Bang on, skipper!" Ventral gunner Rich cried out. The RT erupted into wild cheering as the Hampden went for altitude, leaving the flak far behind. "Nice work, skipper!" "Good shot, Skip!" "Is everybody all right?" Leroyd demanded, ignoring the congratulations. Each man reported in that they were still in one piece. It was almost a miracle, considering the punishing the aircraft had taken. "Right, John, set course for home," Leroyd ordered. "Okay, Skip," came Lewis's confident reply. "Send the signal, Willis," Leroyd said, asking the wireless operator Sergeant Willis to transmit a short Morse code message to base in England, informing them that they had successfully attacked the target. The M-bomb was later recorded as landing inside the aqueduct's channel, slightly to the northeast. "Will do, Skipper," replied Willis. "Oh, Skip, you won't believe this." "What's up?" Leroyd replied, fearing trouble. "One of the pigeons has only gone and laid a ruddy egg." Everyone burst into laughter. A carrier pigeon had laid from the height of the attack. It helped to let out some of the pent-up tension of the past few hours. Leroyd, grinning, gripped the vibrating controls with both hands and started to turn onto the compass bearing Lewis gave him. But something was wrong. The smile that coasted his lips vanished. Something was very, very wrong. You have been listening to The Bridge Busters, The First Dam Busters and The Race to Save Britain, written by Mark Felton, published by Mandalay Books, and narrated by Mark Felton. For short videos on a wide variety of military history topics, please visit my YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions, details below. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below. Tune in next time for the final episode of The Bridge Busters.